Hello everyone, my name is Alex and I am a cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. I've been developer for the last 20 years and I took various roles in different companies. But what I'm really interested in is the DevOps part and the agile project management as part of the software development process. A couple of years back, I've been part of a product group, and over the course of 4 years, we developed a pretty decent DevOps process in place. Now, doing a retrospective at what we have achieved, one of the things that I realized is that we really spend a lot of time at configuring and maintaining the tools that we use for our DevOps process. You see, we've been using different tools for all the aspects that we needed. We had a separate build system, separate source control system, separate system that was managing our bugs or where we were reporting our bugs, and a completely separate system that kind of managed our agile process. All of these had to be integrated in order to work together, and at the top of it, we really deployed to an on-prem environment. It turned out that we need to have a separate team to manage this entire tool set. Now, it was not until I joined Microsoft that I discovered the Azure DevOps services, and I really realized that this is a one-stop shop for all your DevOps needs. It provides you with all the necessary tools that are integrated and working together. And in addition, you can actually include external tools. So within this session, I'll try to present you with the most interesting parts and do a little bit of a hands-on overview. So let's go and start doing that.
Now, regarding Azure DevOps, some of you might be familiar with previous incarnations of this product. It was known as Team Foundation Server and later as Visual Studio Team Services. The latest version of this product is called Azure DevOps Services, and as of today comes with 5 different services that you can choose to mix and match based on your project or organization needs. To name them one by one, these are Azure Boards, where you can manage your project and product backlog, your team structure and organization, as well as your overall project management process. Azure Repos is a place to manage your code. It's a source control system, but allows you a lot more by using code reviews or policies if you wish. Azure Pipelines is really the bread and butter of Azure DevOps. This is where continuous integration and continuous deployment happened. The next one is Azure Test Plans, where you can manage your exploratory tests. And finally, Azure Artifacts, which is a repository where you can keep and manage your build artifacts. With that said, it's important to know that Azure DevOps provides integration with some of the most popular tools. Again, just to mention a few, these are Jenkins, Terraform, Puppet, Chef, even Ansible. Of course, you have an access to even more capabilities through a mechanism that's called extensions. There is a marketplace that provides really hundreds of extensions for almost any tool that you can imagine. If something is not really there, you can even create one of your own and contribute it back. Now, one of the things that you must understand is that Azure DevOps was built in order to support any programming language, any framework, any platform, and deployment environment. This could be not only Microsoft Azure, but the other popular clouds as well. Now, let's switch gears and create a project. In order to do that, we are going to use a tool that's called Azure DevOps Project Generator. It's publicly available and it provides you with a number of templates. These templates are based on different technologies and you can use them just to start any of your projects. Once the project is created, this is the initial view of Azure DevOps that you'll see. It's a project where we have enabled all of the 5 services that are available. Azure Boards, essentially where you can see all your work items. The next one is the repos. That's where our code is. We can browse through the files that are there. In Azure Pipeline, as part of the project, we currently have one pipeline. As you will see, it's not started yet. But let's quickly check what are the tasks and what we are executing there. In pipelines, we also have the release part, where we also have one release pipeline. And this pipeline is configured to have 3 environments: development, QA, and production.
Now let's jump to the first section of this tool. It's the so-called Azure Boards. This is where you do your product and project management part. This is where you manage your team, your work items. That's where you do all your reporting.
In Azure Boards, you have the option to create dashboards. You can create a dashboard for the overall project as well as dashboards for each team. For our convenience, we have new work item widget here. So let's use it to create some work for our team. Just a definition, work item in Azure DevOps is the primary entity with which you define work in Azure DevOps. From this widget, we just enter a name, select the type of the work item, and we are ready to click Create. After that, we are presented with a view of the work item type itself, where we can add a little bit more details. Now we can see a lot of properties here, but we'll focus on some of the important parts. We can see that this work item is not assigned. It has an area where it is assigned, and we just need to place it in an iteration. So let's schedule it for Sprint 2 and further place it in the area path that we defined for our new team. So let me save the changes and go back to Azure Boards and see if it appears there. Now at the work item view, I can see the product training work item of type epic that I've created. Now since this is an epic, we can start adding details about the specific work that needs to be performed.
You can start adding your work items. You can organize them by epics, features. You can organize them into backlogs, assign them to different sprints, kind of assign different work items to different teams, and even kind of start reporting your bugs there. You can organize this in a way that you have a Kanban board that's like fully configurable. You can create different swim lines, you can add columns, you can add tagging and all those information. It's really a comprehensive tool. You can do even things like adding your vacation time so that you know how you can estimate your work. Now, I'm not going to go in all the details of this tool because I want to focus on building some pipelines, but I'm just going to show you a snapshot, or let's say a view of a board.
Just for the useful purposes to be able to view all the cards, I also have a view that's kind of holding all the cards for all projects, including the work areas that's been assigned to all teams. So in this board, you can see all the work that has been scheduled. You see that I have a swim line as well. I've been using tags and annotations pretty well, priority as well. And at the expedite swim line, you can see that we have a bug, which kind of gives me a visual hint that it's something that I need to address right away. And with all those cards on the board, you can see that cards can pile up pretty fast. So all those customizations of colors and tags and annotations can come pretty handy when you need to manage a lot of work.
This was a very, very brief overview of Azure Boards and the functionality that's there. But let's move to our next section and go to the Azure Repos.
Now, once you land at the Azure Repos, there are a few things that you will notice. The first thing is that you will notice that we have a file view. So depending if you have something in your existing repo, you can browse through the files and even make some modifications. Additionally, you can see the commit history. After all, this is a source control system. You also have a dedicated branch view, which provides a very convenient way to manage your repo branches as well.
Things that you can do with the branches, and I'm not going to go in all the details that are there. To mention a few interesting things, though, is that basically you can enforce policies on the branches. You can do locks on the branches, so not everybody can commit there. This could be part of your branching strategy. You can do tagging as well. And of course, there's this very handy feature that if you accidentally delete a branch, there is a brief window of opportunity where you can actually revive it. Now, one of the things that I really like about Azure DevOps services is that there is this good connection between Azure Board and the branches or the branches management. Basically, you can create a branch out of a working item, or when you are kind of making a commit, you can list the work items that has been kind of managed there and what you have been working on. And this gives you this very, very nice documentation of the work that you're doing, as well as it's kind of ensuring that your developers are not working on work that has not been scheduled or it's not available in your project management system.
Let's try and do some changes in the files that we have. Now, when we are changing files, it's a good idea to link them to specific work items. This means that the work that we are doing is visible and it's tracked in our project management system. So let's go to Azure Boards and select a work item to start working on. So conveniently, I can see this bug at the top of the list item. So obviously, let me try to address it. So once the bug is selected, I can see all the details, and there is this very convenient handy feature on the right part that states development. The branch is created out of the master branch. It's linked to the specific feature, so let's create it. So let's double check that. Let's go to the list of the branches in the branch view, and we can see that we have our branch here. It's the second one from the top. And with that, I think that we are ready to make some changes in the files. Now here at the top, just under the repo name, you can see that I have this list, and I can see that currently I'm in the new branch that I have created. Now you can edit the files with any editor locally within your local Git repo, and then push the changes back, but there's like this handy feature that I can make modifications directly from here. So let me just choose a file and try to edit it. I'll just add a few lines. So once I'm done with my changes, I need to save them, and the way to do this in Azure DevOps is click on commit, which will actually create a new source code commit. Now let me put some commands that would be useful for me, but I can see the branch name, but here as well I have an option to link the specific commit to a specific work item. So just let me select the bug that I'm working on, and once that's done, I'm ready to save and commit my code.
So when we are talking about commits and pushing changes to the source control system, a really important part is the way that you manage your pull request and your code reviews. In Azure DevOps, that's pretty straightforward. So let me give you a little bit of a demonstration where we have a pull request and how we are doing the code review as part of this pull request.
As you can see, it's really straightforward and easy to do that in Azure DevOps. All I need to do is create a name for the pull request. I need to give it a little bit of a description, and as you can see here, I have another option as well to add a work item. Once already been added, maybe I can add another one, but as you can see, you can always link your work, or let's say your code modifications, to a specific work item. Now at the bottom you can see the contents of the two modified files, the so-called diff, what was the original file, what was the new one, but let's go further and create the pull request. Now with the pull request in place, there are a couple of things that I can see. I can see that the current pull request is in an active state. And I also have the approve and complete actions. And these kind of take us to the part where you do your code reviews. And that's a very handy practice so that you can have a second pair of eyes going over the modifications of the code to ensure the quality and check what are the modifications done by our fellow developers. And even if I haven't been working on this pull request, I can see the files that are included in the pull request. I can also look at the updates and check the specific commits that are there as well. And this is very, very useful because there is a dedicated space where you can see the pull requests that are there. It might be an option that me as a developer has been assigned as a reviewer for specific branch or specific pull request. So that would be the place where I can see the pending pull request that I need to review. So going back to the one that we created, in the file section, I can see the difference between the two files. And if I want, I can make a command or leave a command to the original creator with some maybe hints or let's say some information that could be helpful or something that could be done better. Now, by leaving these commands, that's a way for me to point out issues that needs to be resolved before pulling this code back to the master branch. This could be very, very useful in order really to ensure the quality of your code. As you can see, once I left the command, currently it's an inactive state, and there is also a feature with this small field below that where I can kind of make modification, place the reply, and mark this as a resolve. So back to the overview, I can see the command, and just in order to move further, let me quickly resolve this one. So in this way, I have addressed the command that was left for me. Now, in order to proceed, really all issues needs to be resolved. So if you look at the top right part, currently it states that all pending commands have been resolved. Now the next stage of this process is really to change the status of this pull request. As you can see, there are a couple of options here. I'll just select approve to be completed. Now before finally hitting the complete button, just let me quickly show you there are a couple of options to manage this pull request as well. And finally, let's go and complete the pull request. Now with that, you're presented with this form where you can put some commands and name for the merge commit. There are a couple of handy features here as well. So one of them is to complete the associated work item that's related to this pull request. So if there are any work items that have been related, they will be automatically moved to the complete column here. There's also an option to automatically delete the branch that was used to manage the specific work and code. Finally, there are a couple of options in order to manage how is the pull request merged to the master branch. Now the default options are good for me, so let's select the complete. And once that's done, you can check that at the top left part, we changed from active to complete, so these pull requests have been completed.
I hope that this gave you a good overview of the Azure repos themselves. One of the things that needs to be mentioned there as well is that it's not just one repo that you can have in the project. You can create multiple repos. So whether you're going with a mono or multi-repo strategy for your project, that's completely doable in Azure DevOps. With that, let's switch to the Azure Pipelines, which is the part where we do our CI/CD.
Here at Azure Pipelines, you can see that we have one pipeline listed. It has been created for us by the DevOps generator tool. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to create a completely new one so that you can see the process end to end. And with that, let's click on the new pipeline button. Now, once you go into this section, you will see that you need to choose where is your code. We are always starting from the code. You definitely need to tell to the Azure Pipeline where to take your code from. There are several options and a couple of supported source control systems, so Azure Repos, Bitbucket. We also have a great integration with GitHub. And last but not least, you can use a generic Git repo and Subversion. Now, the other important part here is that you need to kind of select how your pipeline is going to be organized. As of today, there are two options to do that. One is to use the so-called YAML file. The other option is to use the classic editor. The difference here is that if you're using the classic editor, basically you are going to use a visual editor where you can use drag and drop to organize and create and configure your tasks. The YAML file, on the other hand, is a little bit more advanced. It's a text file where you use sort of a scripting language to describe your build. Now, you might say, why should I use the YAML file? There are a lot of benefits to do this. If you have this as a file, you can basically have it in the version control system. You can kind of make modifications. Essentially, over time, your build task will change depending on your code changes as well. So it's a very nice way to track your build pipeline. The good thing is that even if you use the classical editor, at the end of the day, you can export what you have created there to a YAML file and again have the benefits of storing this in the source control system. So let's go to the classic editor and configure our pipeline. So once I made the classic editor, I need to select where's my source code. Currently it's in the Azure Repos. There are several options that I choose: the theme project, the repository name, and which is the default branch where I want to start. At this point everything looks good, so let's click on continue and go to the next step. Now here on the next step there's something very interesting. As you can see, I can select among a number of templates. So the templates are, let's say, pre-built lists, a list of tasks, or let's say recipes that you can use to build common projects, or let's say a common type of projects. Of course, if you wish, you can start with an empty build job and start adding all the tasks one by one. And very often that would be the way that you will go. But for this specific project, I know that it's an ASP.NET one, so let me kind of use the shortcut and really start from pre-built template. And with that, we are in our build pipeline, and that's where we actually manage all the tasks one by one on what we need to do in order to kind of convert our code to a build artifact. Now, you can see there are several options here, but looking at the task, basically I will build the code, I will build the solution, then I'll run the tests that are associated, and finally I'll try to store the final artifacts in a place that I can use to go within the next step of the process. Now, you'll see that even here, I can change where my source code is. So I might even decide to use a different branch, which might be a feature branch or a bug fixing branch. Now, there is one specific option that I would like to draw your attention, and that's the clean option here. Now, this is a part that you can use as part of your build process. So for example, if this is not a hosted pipeline, meaning that it's using Azure machines to make the build, but it's rather a private build pipeline, meaning that the build machine is actually on-premise to you, you can set this option to false, which would mean that the build machine is not going to clean up any previous work, and you can actually save some time and speed up your builds in this way. Now with that, let's check what else we can modify before starting the build. We have the variables option here. And that's very handy if you have some parameters or you would like to parameterize your build. So this would be the place where you'll place those variables as part of your build. Now, once these variables are created, they are named and you can use them in the build tasks as parameters. The next option that you'll see is triggers. Essentially, that's the part when you state when to start your build pipeline. There are a couple of options out there. You can have scheduled builds like nightly builds, for example. But the really interesting part here is on the right, which states enable continuous integration. And with that, you're making a connection between your code commits and your build pipeline. So for example, if there is a commit in a specific branch, this could trigger your build process. And in its very essence, that's the continuous integration right here. Moving along to the options menu, basically this is the place where you can do a lot of modification on your build job as well as your naming or let's say the way that you name your artifacts. So if you have a specific way of naming your build artifacts, like using a SAM version, date of the build, or something like this, you will usually use this place to define all those details. You also have an option to configure the so-called status badge. Essentially, it's a very small icon that you can place, let's say, in your website or let's say GitHub if you're taking your source from there, which will give you a visual representation of what was the status of the last build, whether it was successful or whether it has failed. So you don't really need to go back to Azure DevOps and the pipelines in order to see the status. Now, next is the retention policy. And the retention policy generally states for how long your build artifacts will stay and be available. Now, you can imagine that over time, when you're running large number of builds, these builds will generate artifacts and they will start taking up space. You will be charged for that space. So having a good retention policy is really, really important. If you want to keep your artifacts for a really long duration of time because they are release artifacts or something like this, essentially you can move them to Azure Artifacts. Now with that, let's move to the last section here. That's the history part. And as you can see, currently it's empty, it has nothing there. But that's because we haven't actually started our pipeline. But once we start using the pipeline, this will give us an overview and history of when exactly this pipeline has been run and what were the results. And with that, let's try to save our pipeline and run it. We have this handy option here that says save and queue. And this is, of course, going to save the changes in our pipeline, but it's also going to schedule a new build and put it into the waiting queue. Now, what queue means is that, for example, if you're using the free version, you can only have one active pipeline. So if there's any build or release pipelines that are currently running, this one would be queued, and once the currently running one finishes, this one will start. Now, generally, if you don't want to be in a situation like this, you can go for the paid version and really purchase additional queues. You can also add your private build pipelines as well. Of course, this all depends on your build frequency and your needs. So let's go further and run this pipeline. With this, I just need to provide a short name. What's this build all about? I can here quickly see the agent specification. Agent specification in current state is set to the VS 2017. So that's Visual Studio Code 2017 running on Windows machine. Now you can have different agent specifications, you can create some of your own, and essentially the name will give you an idea what are the build tools that are available there so that they are used to build your artifacts. The agent pool, on the other hand, just above the top, this kind of gives you an idea which are the build machines that we are using for this specific build. Now, Azure Pipelines in this case states that we are going to borrow a build agent from the virtual machines available for the Azure DevOps service. These VMs are hosted and managed by Microsoft, so you just lease them during your build. So let's click save and run the build. So moving here at the build screen, what we can see that there is an agent job 1 which was scheduled, and currently it's in a status queue. This means that it's waiting for a build agent to become available to us. Now at the top part there's also some interesting information there as well. We can see which repo we are using for this build. We can also see which is the branch, which is the latest change commit that has been used. Now the interesting part here is that we can see the work items that are linked to this build. Now this doesn't seem like much, but it's a very handy feature when it comes down to traceability. In this way, if that's a successful build and we can move it forward, we can trace back which are the work items that are there, and based on this plan our test strategy. Now let's click on the agent job and see what's going on there. As of now, we are still in queue, but once the agent becomes available, we are moved out of the queue and the build process starts. As you will notice, here on the left part, we have a list of all the tasks that are being executed as part of our build pipeline. Now, on the right part, you can see the log files and the output of each of these tasks. So essentially what's going on during the execution of this task. Now, this is extremely useful. So you can kind of check what's going on with your build. When you're creating your build, you can see if something's going wrong or if the build essentially breaks. You can kind of go back to these logs and resolve the issue there. One of the good practices that I found based on my experience is that while you are creating your build pipeline, you need to do a lot of debugging, and you can essentially add an Azure CLI task or Azure PowerShell task. As part of these tasks, you can do simple things like listing folders, reviewing contents of file. So this would give you even further information as part of the build process that could help you troubleshoot some issues. Now, this build might take a couple of minutes, so in order for, let's say, efficiency, let me time-lapse this for you. Now, once the main build tasks are completed, there are a couple of post-processing tasks as well. These tasks would be basically publishing the artifacts at a place that we can use for further releases, but also finally we need to have our reports and generate the reports out of the build. So speaking about reports, once the build is done, let's go and see what we can learn from this build. Now here at the build reporting page, we can see whether our build was successful or not. As you can see, there's been a warning as part of the build process, so that's also presented to us in order to address it. Now at the top we can see how much time did the actual build take, what is the pass rate of the tests if you have a unit test here as well. Of course the related work items are there, but also you can see how much artifacts this build has produced. I've mentioned unit tests, and let's drill down into the test section to see what we can learn. And here at this section we have a very nice visual representation of the tests that have passed. What is the pass rate? Now we can also see the run duration of the unit test. Currently it's set to 5 seconds, nearly 6 seconds, and you can see there's a little arrow that says that it's increasing time. And that's really 100% increase because it's our first run. But based on based over number of builds, you can compare these and see if your unit tests are taking too much time, so you can create a new strategies for them.
Now we have just finished our build pipeline. We created our first build, we unit tested it. We also have the metrics to track and see whether our build time is improving or test time is kind of declining. So we have all the necessary tools to kind of create the artifacts that we are going to deploy. The deployment is done through the Azure release pipeline. So let's go and actually build one. When you start building a new pipeline, you're presented with an option to choose from the available templates that are listed here. On this screen, you can see two things that are different from what we previously saw at the build pipelines. These are the artifacts part and the stages part. At the artifact part, basically you are selecting which are the artifacts that you will use for your release or your deployment. We'll see this a little bit later, but as part of the artifacts, you can use different inputs. This could be artifacts that are produced from your build pipelines or other static binaries that are available to you. On the stages side of the things, these are the environments where you define the places where you will make your deployments or your releases. Just for example, you can define development, QA, and production environment, or use some other scheme or configuration that kind of fully suits your deployment needs. Now, let's move further and create a project using one of the available templates.
So once we select the template, there are two things that you will see immediately. At the stage part, we have one job with one task that will actually make the deployment itself. Now, currently, the stage is named stage 1. It's not very descriptive, so let me provide a more descriptive name for this stage. I'll name this one a QA stage. Next step, that's also a good practice. Let me give a better name for the entire release pipeline. Giving a little bit more description basically will allow me to better organize my projects. And once that's done, I'm ready to add an artifact. That's basically required in order to have something to deploy as part of the actual release. Now here on the artifact page, as you can see, I can add artifacts from various places. Initially, I can use the ones that are available from the build pipelines, but as you can see, there are a couple of other options as well. I can pull an artifact directly from the source code repository. So let me add an artifact by using the build pipeline that we previously defined. As you'll see, I have an option to select the latest artifact, which means that the latest artifact produced by the build pipeline will be used for the release. With all that said and done, let's add the artifact. By doing this, you'll see that the artifact section changed, and now we have some data populated there. Just for the sake of simplicity, I must know that you can make releases that have multiple artifacts as input. So you can have a combination with artifact coming from the build pipeline and some static libraries that are included directly from your source repo, just for example. Now with that, I think that we are ready to address the red mark at the QA stage part. It's a visual hint that there's something that we need to do in order to make this work. So let's open it and see what's the problem there. Here you'll see a very similar interface of what we have in Azure build pipelines. Basically, there's a set of tasks. You can add tasks, but as part of the release pipeline, in order to make a deploy, you need to state which is the environment where you will make the deployment. Now, since I'm deploying to Azure, I need to provide an Azure subscription. This will point the pipeline where the actual deployment will be made. Now, when you're adding a subscription into the release pipeline, you need to authorize the subscription. By doing this, you prove that you have the rights to actually deploy in this subscription. Now, in my particular case, I just click on authorize, and since all my credentials are okay, this should be pretty straightforward. By successfully completing this process, the pipeline is now authorized to make a deployment in my subscription. By completing all those actions, I've enabled this particular stage of the release pipeline to make the necessary actions and deploy in my subscription. Now, additionally, as you can see, I can manage the triggers that basically kickstarting the release pipeline. As you will see in this page, I can enable the continuous deployment. What this means that each time there is a successful build, the release pipeline will be started automatically. Additionally, you can further configure the build branch filters, and by this you can kind of limit and state from which branches a release will be triggered. I'll currently use the default one, but there's no problem for you to configure multiple branches that can be used as part of the trigger process. I will disable this for now in order to be able to start the release by manual trigger. Now, I think that we are ready to start the release pipeline, and by doing this, we'll create the so-called release. Basically, it is called like this because we are linking a specific configuration of the release pipeline with some already available and versioned artifacts. So once I trigger the release pipeline, here I can see that a new release has been created. I can quickly validate what's the situation. I can see that it's been manually triggered, and currently it's in the queue.
This means that we are waiting for a build agent to become available. The other thing that we can see is that there is a relation between the release pipeline and the build pipeline. That's because the build pipeline produces the artifacts that are used by the release pipeline. And this helps with the traceability of the entire process. Once the release pipeline starts, we can see the tasks executing one by one. Very similar to the build pipeline, you can see the output and the complete log of the entire process. Now, once the build is completed, we can see that everything is green. So our deployment was successful. Now, let's take the next step and develop this release pipeline a little bit further. We'll do that by adding a second stage in the release pipeline. Now, in this particular case, this could be a completely new environment, so let's call the new environment release stage. When we start with editing the release pipeline, there's a very handy feature here. It kind of allows me to clone a specific stage, and basically I'll create an exact copy of the previous stage, which I know that it's working. The new stage will have absolutely the same task as the one that I cloned. Now, what we can further see is that the two stages are connected, and in this connection there is a pre-deployment and post-deployment conditions. I can configure those, and what this allows me is to state what are the conditions that needs to be met in order for the release pipeline to progress further in the next environment. When I check the available options, I can see there's like a post-deployment approvals. Basically, this could be a manual process where a live person approves the release to progress to the next stage. But the thing that I wanted to show you is the so-called release gates. The release gates allows me to do some automatic checks and ensure that the release is stable to progress. Now, you'll see that there's a couple of options for release gates that I can add. To quickly name a few, I can check the Azure policies, invoke a custom function. I can also use the Azure REST API. Very handy feature is to use the Azure Monitor as a way to check the quality of the release once we already have something running. But what we are going to do is actually to query the work items. Now, what this allows me to do is basically to run a query across my Azure boards and the work items that are there. Now, there might be conditions there that could kind of hint me whether I'm ready to go to the release stage. There's a set of pre-built queries, and one of them allows me to check whether any of the work items that are included have critical bugs. Now, if such exist, obviously it's good that they need to be resolved before progressing further. Now what I'll do, I'll configure a recurring checks of the status of the build. Once I've configured the release gate, I'm ready to change the name of the stage to production. The final part of this process is to make some changes at the configuration for the environment of the production. Since that's a clone of the existing environment, what I need to do is to change the subscription or the environment where the production needs to be deployed. I'm going to use the same subscription, but I'll use a different application service, which will basically host my production code. Once all those changes are complete, what's left is basically to save the pipeline and schedule a new release. Now, this is a process that you've already seen and you're familiar. The only difference is that we have these two environments here. Now, once the QA stage is completed and the artifact is deployed, the deployment gate kicks in. And from what we can see, we have a little problem here. The query has returned information that we have a critical bug that we need to resolve. What I can do is really go back to Azure Boards and run the same query here and kind of see what's left to be done. I can see that there is one bug that needs to be resolved, and there's a feature branch that's already available. Now, just for the sake of the time, let me mark this one as done, and let's see what will happen next. Just to make sure, I'll rerun the query so that I can make sure that there's no pending bugs. there's no critical bugs. Let's go back to Azure releases. Now, what we can see is that we are still stuck at the QA stage. We have a 3 minutes timeline for recurring checks to see if the issues has been resolved. Once the timer runs out and query reruns, let's see what will happen. Now, what we can see is that we are all green, meaning that there are no critical bugs. With this, the release pipeline progress to the next environment or next stage. And as we can see, the production deployment currently is in progress. With that, we have completed our continuous integration and continuous deployment part. We used two environments. We introduced a kind of a gate between them so you can check the quality of the code before moving from a QA to a production environment. There are a lot more features and I definitely encourage you to go and explore the tool. It's very important to mention that there is a free tier of Azure DevOps, which kind of provides you with a very, very decent offer. You can start with up to 5 users and you have unlimited public and private repos. You also have like one build pipeline with quite a few build minutes. So definitely go there and check it out. I hope that you found this session interesting, so enjoy the rest of the event.